So if you just saw the recording button, if you do not want to be recorded on camera, you should go ahead and turn off your cameras. This meeting will be available on the website after tonight. So if you don't want to be on our website or on screen, then go ahead and turn off your cameras. It looks like we've got something like 80% like the natural setting and the beauty, sound of the waves, sanding your toes. 10% surfing and water-related recreation. About 13% viewing and being near wildlife. Do you live in Stinson Beach? We've got quite a few Stinson Beach residents. I'm going to end the poll pretty soon. Doesn't look like the numbers are changing much now. So here's our results. Lots of people enjoy the natural setting at Stinson Beach. Lots of people enjoy being near wildlife. We've got a few surfers or maybe some other kind of water-related recreation going on there. Got 58% of the people here that live at Stinson Beach and 42% that don't, which is great. I'm glad to see that we reach so far out into the community. 62% live in a home that they think is subject to impacts from future sea level rise. 38% are feeling a little more secure. And in terms of the greatest concern about sea level rise at Stinson Beach, there's a lot of concern about loss of public access and beach use. A strong 42% there. Another almost 20% flooding of my home, or ability to evacuate in the event of a flood is another 15%. Losing structural integrity of my home is 8%, and construction of seawalls along the beach is 15%. So, and I just realized I had not shared the results, so I'll leave this up there a little longer. I thought you all could see it. So while that's up there, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our team tonight. We have Julia Elkin, who is a planner with the Community Development Agency, and she is going to be working on the next phase of this of planning for sea level rise in Stinson Beach. And we have Kathleen Kilgaraff, and she is also a planner with CDA, and she's currently working on the LCP policies for environmental hazards. And we are not going to talk about that tonight, but just want you to know how gifted she is. And then we also have James Jackson, who is with Environmental Science Associates and who are the consultants for this project. And he's going to do a nice long presentation for you tonight and talk about the technical aspects of this project. So I'm going to share my screen here for a couple slides. Just share out our agenda. Can everyone see that? Great. So tonight, really the goal of the meeting is to present the findings of this study, and we want to do it in a way that is really engaging and that helps everybody understand the complexities of the study. So we just did our welcome poll and some introductions. And we're going to start then on a presentation of the study. So we're going to take 2 question and answer breaks during the presentation, one in the middle and then one at the end. So during the presentation, please make sure that you stay muted. If a question comes up that you want to ask right away, just type it into the chat, and I'll show you where that is in a minute. And then during the question and answer session, you can raise your hand, and I'll show you how to do that as well in a minute. When you type your questions into the chat, you can just send them to everybody, and then we can try to see that we don't get too many of the same question repeated over and over again. And I'll field those questions with help from my team here. And then once again, this meeting is being recorded, so if you don't want to be on camera, you should turn your camera off. So here's how the Zoom functions work. If you want to type a question into the chat, say during the presentation, this is where you do it, right here. If you want to raise your hand, you go to the reactions, a menu comes up and you hit raise hand. That's a really helpful function for verbally expressing a question, because James will be able to see who raised their hand first and call you in order. If you don't want your video on, this is where you turn it off. And if you do verbalize a question, this is where you will unmute yourself. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And we are going to move straight into, do we have Jack on, Kathleen?
I do not see him.
Okay. So I just want to say our planning manager, who I think most of you know and probably like just as much as we do, because he's a joy to have around, is having some technical difficulties. So we may give him an introduction in the first question and answer session. So stay tuned for that. And then James, why don't you go ahead and start?
All right. Thank you, Leslie. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Let me get my slides up and we can get going here. All right. Welcome. It's been a while since we've last connected. I know that the pandemic has been a challenge for all of us, and it's great to be able to reconnect with you all and talk about our study to look at dunes as an adaptation strategy along sea drift in Stinson Beach. I'm going to talk briefly first about some of the initial tasks in the study that we kind of could characterize as our homework, so to speak, before we really got down to the analysis and evaluated how dunes and other natural features might perform. And so I'm going to start by going over existing conditions. We did a study to characterize all the background information and did some surveys and other efforts to characterize our current understanding of Stinson Beach. I'm going to review the climate scenarios and the evaluation criteria that we used, and look at how we developed the different adaptation alternatives at Stinson Beach. And then we'll take a break and get into the details on the evaluation of those adaptation alternatives, the specific technical analyses we did, the main takeaways, and conclusions and next steps. After that, we'll have another opportunity for questions and answers. But if there's an urging question that anyone may have, feel free to enter it in the chat, like Leslie said, or raise your hand. I'll try to keep an eye on that and call as we go. So this can be a little less formal. So the Stinson Beach Nature-Based Adaptation Feasibility Study consisted of a number of tasks. Like I said, we started by characterizing the existing conditions. We defined the sea level rise scenarios and the adaptation criteria, and then we developed and evaluated the alternatives. We also had a number of public outreach and engagement opportunities. We had one in-person meeting way back when, and then have had some virtual meetings since, and put out materials and engaged with you all. We've also had regulatory policy input. Sub-consultant Brad Damitz on our team helped to consider and summarize the potential regulatory and policy implications of these alternatives. And we packaged everything up together in a feasibility study report. Here are a few example photos along Stinson Beach, the sea drift being the top right photo, looking along that rock revetment. And then in the middle photo, there's in the patios neighborhoods where there's some existing dunes. And then another photo down in the Cayes area where we've got a nice wide beach at the time, but not a lot of dunes and homes right on the beach. So what do we do to determine existing conditions? I'll just do a quick review here. We've got a lot of great documentation that's posted on the Marin County's webpage if anyone's interested in looking into further detail on any of this. But we first characterized the site. We did a topographic survey where we walked the beach and took survey cross sections along the beach to measure the elevation and width, the backshore conditions. During that effort, we also sampled sediments of the beach from the back of the beach out into the surf zone so that we could characterize the grain size of the sand and quality of the sand as a basis of understanding of what's the most desirable matching sands that we might look for to implement these dunes specifically. We characterize the onshore and offshore ecology, so looking at the plovers and other birds on the beach, as well as a detailed reconnaissance of the nearshore conditions, mapping the habitats just offshore of Stinson Beach so we could understand the potential implications that adaptation may have on the local ecology. And we also reviewed reference sites, looked at a number of natural dune systems in the vicinity of Stinson Beach. There's Dillon Beach and another couple of beaches up the coast in Marin County that we looked at the general dimensions of the dunes, measured their height and width and what the fronting beach looks like there, so we could develop an understanding of how natural dune systems are functioning along the Marin County coastline. And we also did a very detailed shore dynamics characterization. So we got all the information that we could, publicly available data on shoreline positions from historic shorelines. And so we did an analysis looking at how that shoreline has moved over time along Stinson Beach. We did a detailed wave transformation model so we could understand how offshore waves refract and transmit into the Bolinas Bay and how those wave conditions influence wave run-up, longshore sediment transport, flooding and erosion along the Stinson Beach coastline. We did that detailed wave run-up modeling to support the analysis, establish baseline conditions, as well as evaluate our adaptation alternatives, which I'll talk about later. And we also did an inventory of potential sediment sources in the region. Here's a photo of me surveying a cross-section along Sea Drift and a schematic graphic here showing wave run-up calculations at this transect location. As part of the existing conditions, we look back at previous flooding events that have occurred and take those into consideration. Here are a couple of photos of El Nino events in years past. The one on the left is a 1983 El Nino, where homes were heavily impacted along the beach. And then here's another photo from the USGS on the right, showing the 1998 El Nino in which the beach was eroded and there was a large wave event that led to damages and heavy wave run-up, as you can see. So this context kind of provides a baseline understanding of what might occur if beach erosion progresses over time with sea level rise, and that beach will get narrower and narrower, and not having a beach and not having dunes, you may end up with some heavy storm impacts, as a lot of the residents in Seadrift and Stinson are aware of. Here's an overview graphic showing the study reaches that we defined for the feasibility study. We broke the shore down into 4 reaches. The Seadrift reach being the longest reach, and it has an existing rock revetment that is exposed in some locations and buried within the sandy dune vegetation in other areas. And so we have 2 shore profiles to represent those 2 conditions. You can see in this graphic, there's the narrowest beach can be seen along the western portion of Seadrift, whereas in Seadrift East, the beach is a little wider. The patios reach, like we saw in the photo on our first or second slide, has some existing dunes at the back of the beach, and homes are built behind those dunes. Cayes reach, homes in the neighborhood progresses out onto the beach with very little existing dunes. And then we have the National Park Service reach to the southeast, in which the beach is wide. There's less development, but still amenities such as the lifeguard stand, restrooms, and restaurant there, as well as their overflow parking lot. And otherwise, they have some tall dunes that are existing. So key findings of the existing conditions assessment. Long-term beach widths along the Cayes, patios, and National Park Service reaches are relatively stable over time, but big storm erosion events have occurred, and they will occur in the future. Beach along Seadrift, especially at the west end, is eroding based on the available data. There are no signs of recent natural dune building along Seadrift or Stinson, and so that leads us to understand that constructed dunes that we may implement along this beach would really rely on humans to maintain them. With natural dune systems, you need a prevailing onshore wind that transports sand up into the back of the beach to help build those dunes. And along Stinson and Seadrift, the prevailing wind direction is mostly along the shoreline. So there's not as much of the natural processes that we could harness, but that's not to say that managed dunes could work as a great strategy along Stinson Beach. And then really another important point is that there's really limited data out there on potential sediment sources, and that meaning how much sediment is out there in a particular source. What's the sediment look like? Is it clean? Is it coarse sand, fine sand? These kinds of details would really help to enable us to know where we need to get that sand. Is there enough sand out there to build and maintain these features, etc. So those are the main important findings of the existing conditions assessment. Climate scenarios. What are we talking about here? Climate scenarios. For our case here at Stinson Beach, we're looking at combination of sea level rise and a storm condition. And so we chose climate scenarios that are consistent with the CSMART work to date with Marin County, looking at vulnerability and adaptation planning for the whole county, and as well as the latest state guidance. And so our understanding is that Stinson Beach is vulnerable to sea level rise, and the project team thinks that really the near to midterm is where we can really harness and realize the benefits of nature-based adaptation. So we're focusing on the near to midterm, which means anywhere from 1 foot to 3.3 feet of sea level rise. And we're looking at no storm conditions, just average progression of long-term erosion, long-term tidal inundation, as well as a 20-year storm event. So thinking about an extreme coastal storm that statistically may happen once every 20 years. That's what we're talking about here. So we looked at those types of scenarios in our evaluation process, and we'll get to that later. Another component of the analysis is our adaptation criteria. When should we do what? When should we widen the dune? When do we need the dune? When do we build the Cobble Berm? When do we need to rebuild any of these features. And so the adaptation criteria that we used are essentially the widths of these features. The beach width, which we'll track over time, the dune width, and the width of the cobble berm. And more or less of these apply depending on the alternative we're looking at. The other criteria that are really the drivers of the analysis are sea level rise. So we look at how the widths of these features change over time with sea level rise. And also we're looking at wave run-up intensity. And so how does the wave run-up intensity change on a dune system versus not having a dune system versus a dune with a cobble berm? So these are kind of the metrics that we use to analyze the alternatives and evaluate them. We then developed 3 alternatives that to evaluate for Stinson Beach. And this the alternatives are based on just overall suitability. Is there space on the beach and enough space to build these features? Do we expect them to be able to persist in the available space? And then the overall desirability, natural context, ecological benefits, how different alternatives might function for protective services, what are the access and aesthetics, and the relative cost. So we understood generally where we wanted to focus. As we started this project, the Marin County and the project team, we're wanting to focus on nature-based solutions. And so this is generally a kind of narrowing down and customization of what combinations of natural infrastructure should we apply for each of these reaches, because each reach is a little bit different and has different constraints and opportunities. So the selected alternatives are the baseline, alternative 0, in which we just assume that armoring is constructed along the development. And so in some cases, the armoring already exists along the sea drift. Armoring would be presumed to be constructed behind the dunes and the patios reach at the development in that patios neighborhood, or at the homes along cayes, or in front of the developed features in the National Park Service reach. Not armoring the whole National Park Service reach, because that is not necessary given the resources and development in that reach. But the 2 nature-based alternatives are a more natural combination of natural infrastructure, alternative 1, and a more erosion-resistant combination for an alternative 2, in which we use a cobble berm. So here are cross sections showing these how alternative 1 varies down the coast. At Seadrift West, given the limited amount of space, we could fit a cobble berm there and could reasonably expect that to do some good as far as reducing wave run up and being able to persist. The beach is too narrow to really fit dunes in this space, so we're just looking at a cobble berm at Seadrift West. At Seadrift East, where there's more available space, we have a dune embankment. At the patios reach, we have 4 dunes, which is a shorter field of dunes. And we chose the dune, 4 dunes at patios because they already have that existing width of dunes, about 65 feet on average. In the cayes reach, given the limited space available and limited existing dunes, for the more natural alternative 1, we looked at 4 dunes with a cobble berm placed in front of it. And at the National Park Service reach, just looking at 4 dunes. For alternative 2, in the more erosion resistant alternative, we're looking at replacing or augmenting the dune alternative with a cobble berm. So again, Seadrift West, just a cobble berm. Seadrift East, we looked at a cobble berm. And for the patios, cayes, and National Park Service reaches, we added a cobble berm in front of those dunes. And in cayes, for the more erosion resistant, we looked at a taller dune embankment. So this is our first Q&A break. I'll scroll up to the first slide just to have a background here. And so if anyone has any questions, I haven't seen the chat as the presenter, I can't really see that. So please,
Yeah.
Leslie, toss them my way.
Yeah, we
And
have a few questions that came in the chat, and also Jack's here, so I just wanted to introduce him. Jack is our planning manager. This is Jack Leapster. Many of you know him. Kathleen, are you able to spotlight him when the screen's being shared? I don't know if that's possible.
I will go and find him. And spotlight, yes.
I'm the guy that's waving.
Hey, there you are.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay.
Hey.
Not really my house.
Jack, it's good to see you.
Good to be
So,
here.
James, the first question is, have there been any studies of the holes, in quotes, that develop most winters generally in the same areas? These seem to be the greatest erosion areas.
that's a good question. I'd love to hear more about what you mean by holes, and I'll take a guess. And looking at this aptly placed photo here, it might be how the shore responds in these kind of undulating cusps along the beach. You can kind of see them in this photo, but that's a natural beach phenomenon that is a function of the wave exposure and the general wave climate. And it's really interesting. Some beaches develop these really interesting scallops that have a kind of consistent wavelength along the shore. I would love to spend more time thinking about that and studying it, but I'm not aware of any specific studies at Stinson Beach looking at this phenomenon. But if I'm off base, please chime up. Otherwise, in general, a storm may impact a different area of the beach in a different way, and that's part of the beauty of the beach. It's always changing and always different. But for example, in evaluating past impacts at Stinson Beach from the 2015-2016 El Nino, we looked at LIDAR that was flown before and after the winter event, and tried to distinguish where those erosion hotspots were. And they really were hotspots. It wasn't a continuous erosion of 20 feet of the dunes along the beach. There were some areas that eroded more, and some were areas that weren't that affected for that particular El Nino. And yeah, just the combination of the wave conditions, the beach conditions leading up to the storm event. If there's a big sandbar in one location, that'll have an influence on how waves break and run up in a given area versus another area that might not have a sandbar that could be hit a little harder because those waves are able to get closer to shore. So those are just a couple of examples of how I've come to love and understand that impacts to the beach are changing year to year, and even from quarter mile to quarter mile of the same beach. That's a great question.
So another question is about the status of the repair of the washout at the Parks North parking lot. And I can say a little bit on that myself, which is that is a National Park Service project. And they hired a consultant to design a new parking lot with a drainage from East Coot Creek that would go out towards Stinson Beach. So it actually is parking lot, but it's paved so that should East Coot Creek overflow, there's a clear a path for it to head out towards the water rather than across the parking lot. And I know that the designs were almost complete the last time I checked in. So I think construction, I'm not sure about the status of the construction. So James, I don't know if you know any more than that.
Okay. I couldn't provide any more detail than that.
Okay. And then someone said, I think the high wind direction is south to north ? As opposed to prevailing wind ?
Can you repeat that?
Someone was making a comment that I think the high wind direction is south to north ? As opposed to prevailing wind ?
Yeah, and when I mean prevailing wind, we looked at a number of wind gauges that are maintained by NOAA, and there is some winds, and wind events that do blow south to north. But overall, the dominant, like, average wind direction seemed to be more along shore, and that was based on the closest available wind gauges. Point Reyes being one of the close ones. So obviously Stinson Beach is a little bit different, but based on our professional experience, we had Peter Bay on our team helping us with beach ecology. And he's been up and down the coast observing dunes, and really love to have his membership on our team. So we thought about that a bit, and it would be great to have a wind gauge. If any of you all want to install one on your roof, I'm sure NOAA would be happy to. Or I don't know, I can't speak for NOAA, but anyway, always good to have local data. And yes, the wind does blow north to south, east to west, but over the year, more wind blows along shore than north to south, as far as our understanding of how we could expect dunes to be maintained. As like you look at Dillon Beach, for example, those big dunes are sustained by winds and waves that blow into the shore, which we don't have as many large dunes at Stinson Beach.
The next question is, could you please clarify if Alt 0 or armor means seawalls / rock revetments, or what?
So we looked at rock revetment as the specific armoring alternative, and developed, compared that alternative. It could be considered as a seawall alternative. It would be another one. Obviously, building a seawall is a little bit more intensive and more costly than a rock revetment. But essentially, yeah, armoring with a rock revetment or a seawall are functionally known as the baseline or alternative 0.
Okay, there's a few more questions here. Oh, quite a few. I think you're going to answer this one in the next part of your presentation. What's a cobble berm look like? Would it be on the land side of the dunes or the sea side of the dunes? Do you want to hold off on that?
I'll just answer it really quickly. In this study, we looked at putting a cobble berm on the sea side of the dunes, so that it could help to maintain those dunes and the functions they serve for ecology and also further wave run-up reduction. And the cobble berm would be about 80 feet wide from the landward side to the seaward side, and just at the beach level or just below the beach elevation. So it would be buried with sand most of the year. We can talk more about it.
Will the dunes or cobble be planted?
The dunes would be planted, yes, and we estimated the effort and cost associated with that in our evaluation of those specific alternatives.
Okay.
Peter Bay would love to tell you more about that.
And as one of the appendices to, I think is it chapter 4? Yeah, I think it's chapter 4. As the appendix to chapter 4 is Peter Bay's actually report on the dune vegetation. So if you go on our website, you'll find that. Question, what do we think about those large, long black tubes buried at Seadrift East? I don't know what those are. I've never seen those.
Not sure. I could guess that they may be a temporary sandbag kind of a structure. I didn't know they had them there right now.
Yeah, me either. Is the 20-year storm magnitude based on historical or projected data? In other words, would the future 20-year storm be more intense than past ones?
Well, that's a great question. We looked at observable erosion impacts from a 20-year storm over the 2015 and 2016 El Nino. So we used a historic event to service as our design storm. And really, when I say that, I mean the design winter, because we could have multiple storms over the course of a winter and have progressive impacts. But we looked at that 2015, 2016 El Nino event because there was good data and we could measure what erosion did happen along the beach. And in the future, there's a lot of hard minds thinking about climate change and how coastal storms will shift in the future. The last I came to understand is that the general wave patterns may not change too much given global climate modeling as it stands today. So it could be similar severity storms, but with progressive sea level rise, the same storm with a foot of sea level rise could have a lot more impacts. Regardless of how the storms are changing, we need to plan for this. So, but I'm sure the next science update will shed more light on how wave climate and storm intensity may change in the future.
We also have a question. What would the height of the dunes be at the cayes under the scenarios you shared? It seems alternative 2 equals 20 feet, i.e. substantially above street level.
Yeah, so let me zoom down to our cross sections here so we can look at that more closely. For the cayes reach, our alternative 1 is about 5 feet high. So the elevations on the side here are in the NAVD datum, which start around mean low tide at 0. So the beach elevation at Stinson is around 9 to 10 or 11 feet NAVD. So we're looking at a 4 dunes that are 5 feet above the beach, or an alternative 2, a dune embankment, which is 10 feet above the beach. So definitely a bit higher, but providing more buffer and more sand in that alternative.
Then Don Anderson has his hand up. So.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was the one who asked the question about those bags of sand buried under the beach there. I believe it's at the first reaches of Seabrook. But it goes back to that question about the holes and your mention about hot spots. Depending on where the storm comes from, it focuses its energy on one certain part of the beach. About 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, those bags got hit again, and they were exposed suddenly. Nobody'd seen them for 20 years. But when they were put in, it was another storm that had hit that same spot and almost took out a house or two. They threw those bags down, buried them, and I don't think anybody had really thought about them until another storm came along and exposed them for a couple of seasons. Is that a useful thing? Are those bags doing their job?
Thank you, Don. I'm going to mute you. There's some background noise coming from that. Go ahead, James.
Yes, sandbags are used as a temporary erosion protection in a number of places. Close by at Ocean Beach in San Francisco, there's a couple of sandbag revetments that have been constructed as interim measures until the longer term planning and construction can progress at South Ocean Beach. And I just recently saw some news about folks on Oahu in Hawaii that have put up similar features that they call burritos. But I think that might be a surfer type of name for them. I think there's probably something more official. But they can be effective short-term erosion protection features, but a bag of sand isn't as strong as a rock revetment or a seawall, nor is it as pretty as a cobble berm with a dune behind it. That's just my opinion.
Hey, Mia wrote in. Mia Monroe from National Park Service is in the meeting, and she said that in mid-November they're having a public scoping engagement meeting to share the preliminary plans for the parking lot. So thank you for that, Mia. So I think a lot of the questions we have right now, you're gonna answer in the next part of the presentation. but there's this one here. Do rock revetments actually work? I have heard they actually increase erosion.
Yeah, that's a good question. They can function for the purposes of keeping erosion seaward of that rock revetment, but as has played out in a number of locations, having an impervious barrier such as a rock revetment or a seawall on a eroding shoreline will eventually lead to more rapid erosion of the beach in front of that seawall. And it may also have downshore erosion effects. So affecting erosion that is just next to that rock revetment, assuming that the rock revetment was built there because the shore is indeed eroding. A really interesting counter to that perspective is the seawall at the north end of Ocean Beach. If anyone's gone to North Ocean Beach lately, they've got the O'Shaughnessy seawall that was built decades ago, and the beach has grown since they built the seawall. But there's more to it than irony. It's more a function of the maintenance of the SF shipping channel and where the Army Corps of Engineers has been placing sand as they maintain that shipping channel, and they actually just dump it offshore. And so that sand has been washing in, and what used to be an erosional beach is now accreting. So just a fun factoid there. But yeah, hard armoring can lead to more rapid beach loss on an eroding shoreline.
And just so everyone knows, can you explain accreting?
Accreting means a growing beach, opposite of erosion. So erosional is the beach is shrinking, the shoreline is moving landward, versus accreting, where sand is building up, building that beach, and the shoreline moves seaward.
Great. There's another question here. Why 20-year return period for the storm and not 50 or 100?
That's a great question. Given the time frame of sea level rise and the our understood abilities of dune systems to withstand heavy storms, the 20-year storm seemed like a great representative design storm to try to mitigate against. If a 50 or larger, even 100-year storm were to hit Stinson Beach, there would be widespread damage, whether you have dunes or rock revetment. And we could actually quantify the impacts of a 20-year storm based on available public information. Whereas, a 100-year storm, we're starting to talk about we didn't really have enough historic data on wave conditions and tides for the location to confidently evaluate, predict what the 100-year storm condition might be. And it's looking at a 20-year storm is just a practical storm condition as far as nature-based features and storm impacts on the beach.
And before we move on and you get back to your presentation, maybe you covered this and I missed it, but could you just make sure everyone knows and understands what a 100-year storm means?
Yeah, so a 100-year storm has the chance of occurring 1% every year. So over time, the 100-year storm is something that might occur once every 100 years. Every given year, you have 1% chance that such a storm may occur. And this is a common storm statistic that's used for FEMA and flood insurance. They map flooding in waterways, whether it's a river or a wetland or a coastline, and they map that 100-year storm as a way of, as part of the flood insurance process. So it's kind of codified as part of the National Flood Insurance Program as a standard storm to consider. We did look at the most extreme wave run-up that we might expect given the record of data that we got for this study, and that information is in our in our reporting and appendices, but we didn't use the 100-year storm to evaluate how a dune may perform compared to a rock revetment or a cobble berm, for example.
Great. Thanks, James. So we're actually on time. Go for it.
Wow, amazing. Imagine that. Thanks, everyone. Those are great questions. And I'm glad I haven't got us off track. So let's jump into the details here. Adaptation alternatives evaluation. So why? Why do we evaluate the alternatives? Well, first we want to know what might work. So the objective is to compare these natural infrastructure alternatives to a traditional armoring approach, in this case, a rock revetment, along the backshore development, and how they stand up against each other. And so we looked at a number of analyses, two main analyses, from which we pulled outputs to various evaluation categories. And so the first analysis was the design life analysis. We looked at what the starting conditions would be when you build a dune or a cobble berm or a rock revetment. What's the beach width when you start? And we modeled the position and width of these natural features over time. We looked at the shoreline and the beach width. We looked at the edge of the dune and how wide that dune is over time as sea level rises, as well as the cobble berm, how wide is that? And for the baseline where we're just looking at armoring, we're tracking that shoreline and beach as it moves over time up to the backshore armoring. And so as we modeled the evolution of these different natural infrastructure features with sea level rise, we were able to determine when a particular feature might need to be maintained so that we can A, maintain that 20-year coastal erosion projection, and B, keep those features viable up to 3.3 feet of sea level rise. And so I'll get into more details on that. We also did detailed wave run-up analysis. We looked at the 20-year particular storm event and how those wave run-up extents might change or how they differ on a beach with just a rock revetment versus a beach with dunes and or cobble berm. And so we looked at the constructed conditions and future conditions with this wave run-up. So let's start by the initial conditions. So we have to have a starting point that is, the kind of the same starting point for all of these alternatives. And so we looked at the beach conditions in the winter of 2019 to download some LiDAR that was publicly available. At the time of the LiDAR flight, the beach was probably at its minimum width for that winter. Quick background, the beach erodes and accretes throughout the year. During the winter, you have more stormy events, more rough seas, and that beach erodes and shrinks. And then when you get to the spring and summer, things quiet down and the overall wave climate end up pulling some sand back up onto the beach, and the beach accretes and grows. And so given the timing of this LiDAR, we determined that we should add a pre-winter beach width. Ideally, natural infrastructure features would be constructed in the fall before a stormy winter for a couple of reasons. One, there's room in the fall, the beaches are wide at that point, and it also is considerate of ecological uses of the beach for specifically snowy plovers in their nesting season. So ideally, we want to construct these features in the fall or early winter. And so we created this idealized profile for each of the reaches that represents these conditions. The graph on the bottom here shows two recent profiles that were surveyed. I surveyed the fall 2019 profile where you can see that beach is very wide. And this example, I believe, is at the Patios Reach, where they have those tall dunes already. And so we added this nominal beach width as the starting point. And we also included a nearshore winter bar, which is often left out of the data because it's in the surf zone and LiDAR can't penetrate water. So the LiDAR data never includes the surf zone. And where there are LiDAR and nearshore bathymetry, you usually don't have the surf zone because boats that measure the bathymetry can't really get into the surf zone. So this is a feature that we're familiar with as professionals and as surfers, that sandbars do form and exist. And so having that as part of the profile was important for understanding the wave impacts specifically. And so on this profile, we constructed all different alternatives, whether it's a cobble berm, a dune, both, and we fit those within the available 100-foot beach width. We also refined the adaptation thresholds when we started to get into our analysis as we better understood the 20-year stormy winter design event that we evaluated. So we refined, what are the trigger beach widths at which point we need to think about building the dune or maintaining the dune, or similarly building and maintaining cobble. And so we use these thresholds, which are slightly different for each reach because of the different conditions along the beach, to determine when we need to maintain these features over time with sea level rise. So that was for the dune width. We looked at the El Nino 2015-2016 LiDAR data, as I mentioned before. For the cobble berm width, we developed a failure threshold of about a 30-foot width. And we did that by looking at the geometry we initially developed of the design berm and the nearby steep ravine. There's a little cobble cove at the bottom of steep ravine, just southeast of Stinson. And so we used that threshold as a trigger for rebuilding the cobble berm in our design analysis. I'll try to be high level here. This is a kind of in the weeds slide where we looked at a new model. We updated our model for modeling shoreline change and dune change to consider the presence of a cobble berm in front of those dunes. And so, as you might imagine, when the beach is very wide, you don't have any dune erosion because the beach acts as that buffer and waves don't get to the dune to erode it. But as the beach narrows, you start to have progressive impacts to those dunes and they erode. And so we've defined these spaces between what the stable beach width is, in which the dune does not erode, and an eroding beach width, where if it gets down to that beach width, you're basically, the shoreline and dune are going to erode at the same pace. And the cobble berm essentially functions to buffer that erosion, and it slows down the impacts of the waves on those dunes. So we had different dune erosion models, whether there was a cobble designed in front of it or not. We can talk more about this if anyone's curious. We'll get to the next slide. For the cobble erosion, it functions similarly if we were talking about just a cobble berm without any dunes behind it. If the beach is a certain width, we assume that cobble is not impacted. It's still cozy, buried into the beach. But as that beach shrinks and gets down to essentially the cobble width, it gets down to 80 feet, then you're starting to hit that cobble. And so we modeled the cobble erosion accordingly. And once that cobble eroded down to 30 feet, we would instigate a maintenance event in which the cobble berm was rebuilt, and then quantified that so we could understand how much cobble we need over time. Here is a moderately complicated graph that I'll try to explain that shows how the beach width and dune width and cobble width change with sea level rise. Let's first look at alternative 0, which is black. The solid black line represents the beach width, and the dashed black line represents the dune. And so here we're talking about at the patio's reach where there's already existing dunes. So that shoreline erodes at a relatively constant pace as sea level rises. And then once you get down to the stable beach width, which is the width at which the dunes start to erode, you see those dunes starting to erode, and the beach width actually is maintained a little longer. That's the beauty of having a natural dune system. Those dunes erode during stormy events and supply sand to the beach so that the beach can be more maintained over time as the natural shore can progress together. But as those dunes eroded away and got down to the armoring, then the shoreline starts to erode more quickly again, and the beach would diminish. We only looked at this particular modeling. We only went up to 7 feet of sea level rise because we knew we were focused on that 3.5 feet or 3.3 feet. Let's look at alternative one, where we're widening the dunes at patios, adding some foredunes. So you've got a little more, the beach is hard to see because it's buried through some of the other layers, but you can see the dashed green line. Those dunes are wider initially. And so you've got more room as the erosion progresses, and you basically have dunes sustained for a longer period of time, and the beach is also sustained for a longer period of time. If we introduce a cobble into the system, that takes up more space. So you have a little less beach width initially because you're building dunes and cobble berm. But the cobble berm essentially functions to reduce the shoreline erosion rate and therefore maintains those dunes longer that are behind the cobble berm. And the cobble berm will get hit during the winter. Conceptually, the beach is eroded and the cobble absorbs more waves. And over the following summer, beach sands can build back up, cover most, if not all, of that cobble berm, and thus, realizing that idyllic summer beach condition that we all love to enjoy at Stinson. So from this design life analysis, in which we modeled the beach width, the dune width, the cobble berm width, and identified when we needed to do maintenance in this conceptual model to keep those dunes wide enough so that they could be protective and provide recreational and ecological benefits and all the other benefits that come with a beach and dunes. And we estimated the volumes or quantities that are needed to sustain these features over time. And so the construction quantities include the beach quality sand that we need for the dunes, the cobble and gravel mix that we need for that berm, the cobble gravel berm that sits right under the beach, the dune plantings, and for the case of the armoring baseline, the rock revetment. And again, maintenance for this analysis included long-term maintenance to accommodate 3.3 feet of sea level rise and event-based maintenance, looking at the 20-year storm erosion impacts. So we assumed that this 20-year storm would occur twice over the course of 3 feet of sea level rise, which, given state projections at this point, is estimated to occur around 2068 and perhaps sooner. And so we considered, the timing with when this project could be constructed. We could assume that that kind of storm could happen a couple of times. It may happen less and it may happen more. And so overall, we came up with these volumes of materials for the alternative 1 and 2 for the nature-based solutions, as well as the length of rock revetment for the baseline. And for the rock revetment, that also included maintenance for long-term sea level rise and storm impacts. There's a lot more detail on how we consider these various impacts and maintenance events in our reporting, and I'm happy to talk about it more. And so when we translated that to costs using engineering cost estimate, we see that the nature-based alternatives can be cheaper than a traditional armoring approach. Even since it's doing a sensitivity test off the top of my head here, let's say we have a lot more storms in the future. We could have 2 times as many storms and need to do more maintenance, and it could still be competitive, cost competitive with rock revetments. And a seawall would cost even more than that, given the increased engineering and construction associated with the seawall. So the other big analysis, or the main analysis that we did to evaluate the alternatives, was this wave run-up analysis. And so we wanted to understand with a wave run-up how the hazards might be reduced with adaptation alternatives compared to not having a nature-based alternative. So looked at the no alternative, just simple armoring. And we looked at existing conditions, a typical early winter condition that, nominal beach width that might occur at the beginning of winter, as well as future conditions with 3.3 feet of sea level rise. And we saw with a wider system, wider beach, wider dunes, and cobble included or not in these features, that natural infrastructure can buffer wave run-up during storm events. This table shows the relative wave run-up at each profile in positive or negative number. If it's negative in red, that means the wave run-up went past the development. If it's positive, that means it's that far, the wave run-up only went a certain distance up to that development. So let's just look at the constructed conditions for a second. At existing sea level, the 3 columns on the left, the no alternative, with just a 20-year storm, we get overtopping of the either revetment at sea drift or wave run-up past development at sea drift and cailles versus the patios didn't quite get impacted because they have those, there's some existing dunes that serve as a buffer. So even right there, looking at the baseline condition, we can say that having dunes is beneficial to wave run-up. The adaptation alternatives really reduce the extent of wave run-up, whether it's just a cobble berm at sea drift west or wider fore-dune and dune embankments along the rest of the reaches. We've shown under existing sea level rise that 20-year storm event could be mitigated or less, the impacts greatly lessened, depending on, of course, what that starting condition is when the storms hit. And alternative 2 had cobble berm at the sea drift, so there wasn't any dunes, there was just the lower, rougher cobble, which did reduce the wave run-up compared to no cobble, but having that height of dunes is very effective at reducing wave run-up. So that's why maintaining these dune features over time is really important to realize that wave run-up reduction. With future conditions and 3.3 feet of sea level rise, having armoring and just with very minimal beach, if not no beach, at 3 feet of sea level rise, you have a great overtopping of that way, the revetment or development as the beach reduces and is diminished in most locations, as that photo from the 98 El Nino suggest. With the adaptation alternatives, with a big storm event, we'll still have some wave impacts, but they are reduced, compared with cut in half, if not more, just looking at that lateral exceedance of the waves beyond the development line. So again, pointing out really important that these dunes be maintained over time, and you may have more or less storm events in the future, and it really depends on what those beach conditions are. But overall, natural infrastructure can have a better wave run-up reduction compared to traditional armoring. Another takeaway that a synthesis of our wave and beach modeling results are what's the geomorphic and ecological benefit of having these dune systems compared to traditional armoring. And so we can look at, this is a kind of a summary of how the changes will differ between an armoring alternative and a dune alternative and a cobble alternative. Looking at the top row here, this is the constructed fall conditions. So initially, you build a rock revetment at the beach, at the back of the beach, or you build some dunes, or you build some cobble in front of the dunes to have a little bit more erosion protection. That first winter and subsequent winters, the beach erodes through the winter in a condition where you have the backshore armoring. That beach may diminish all the way in the winter, especially with greater sea level rise. You may have the beach completely disappear. At Seadrift West, this occurs regularly, like every winter. It seems like there are segments of the beach that are very narrow, if not absent, at high tide. Whereas looking at a natural dune system, a natural infrastructure dune system, you'll have some erosion and impacts of the dunes, but you'll have a little bit more beach because the dunes are there. And with a cobble berm, you may have that cobble berm exposed, but you'll have less dune erosion, and overall the dune is maintained in that winter condition. After the storm, or after the winter, when the beach accretes, when the beach grows back because of the summer wave conditions, you'll have a smaller beach, potentially you'll rebuild in front of the rock revetment. You have a slightly wider beach rebuild in front of the dunes because those dunes eroded and provided material to the beach to sustain it. And similarly with the cobble berm, you'll have some erosion of the cobble, but that erosion is absorbing that wave energy, and you'll have a little bit less dune erosion and potentially a beach recovery that's not as great as a full dune system, but better beach recovery in front of the cobble and dune combination. So essentially we're saying here is there's a geomorphic and thus ecological benefit to having natural infrastructure because you have a more naturally behaving beach and coastline that can buffer and absorb the impacts of wave runup, and in that process sustain the beach and the ecological functions that the beach provides for birds and for humans. And so these are some of the takeaways from our design life analysis. Having a wider beach and having wider dunes over time provides a benefit. How much benefit? So as we modeled the beach and dunes and cobble berms, with 3 feet of sea level rise, we're looking at an extra 10 to 50 or 60 feet of beach, depending on, we're looking at the winter or summer conditions. So essentially comparing against an armoring baseline where no sand is added to the system, it's just a rock or seawall at the back of the beach. Having dunes can make a big difference in the winter season because that's when the beach is narrowest and those dunes are activated and help to maintain the beach versus rock revetment that may end up to having quicker beach scour right at the revetment. And then that summer recovery, usually you'll have some amount of recovery of the beach throughout the summer, so that benefit is a little bit less, but it's more beach during the summer, and most importantly, more beach during the winter where you have those stormy events occur, and so they'll have a much better storm wave runner production, having that extra dune sand material and cobble berm to absorb the waves. And more shore for birds, invertebrates, plants, and humans. Another aspect that we considered of these alternatives, all the alternatives, were the habitat impacts that may occur given construction of these alternatives. So construction of anything on the beach is going to affect the local beach ecology. You got to disrupt the sand, you'll disrupt people and plants and animals in order to get these alternatives built. So no matter how you go about it, you're doing something and you're affecting the natural system. So you'll have some impact during construction and during maintenance events. Over the long term, natural infrastructure can have a lower impact on beach and benthic ecology because we're sustaining the beach widths and we're maintaining some dunes. And so this graphic from Jen Dugan shows the unarmored shore and armored shore as a way to compare all of the ecological functions that go on in a beach environment. I won't name all of the features, and I hope you don't have too many raccoons on the beach, but the unarmored shore shows all of the natural processes that go on the beach. You've got seaweed washing up, critters feed on the seaweed, little bugs, and the crabs come in, and the birds eat the crabs, and the bugs on the seaweed. You've got birds nesting. This is a big picture. It's graphic, so you obviously don't have green sea turtles, but this is a thriving shoreline. You've got all the food web is able to thrive and exist on the beach. When you look at an armored shore, you don't have as much function. You've got a barrier in the shore, and as erosion proceeds, it shrinks the beach, and you have less beach area. You don't have the exchange of nutrients and productivity from the back beach to the beach because there's that hard barrier. And overall, you have a much lower functioning ecology on the beach. So takeaways here, you're going to have some temporary habitat impacts to build these features, but over the long run, the impact to the system of having a natural infrastructure implemented versus a traditional armor implemented, the ecology will be better off with using a natural infrastructure approach, given that we have to do something. Again, construction and maintenance is going to have impacts. Another thing we consider, so that graphic was showing the onshore ecology. What about the offshore ecology? Thankfully, along Stinson Beach, we'll expect pretty limited impacts to the nearshore benthic environment because we're not doing really much to change that over time. This is a photo taken by Merkel and Associates, who did our ecological characterization. And this is pretty much what the offshore looks like along all of Stinson Beach and Seadrift. It's open sand, there's some shell hash areas. So having more sand potentially being washing out to sea as a part of this project, dune project, would do little to really affect or harm the nearshore environment. There are a lot of rocky reefs and more, let's say sand habitats, not interesting, but rock reefs and kelp and other more distinguishable habitats exist towards Bolinas over by the patch and the surfing and all those headlands over there. There's a lot more rocky reef kind of habitat, but along Stinson and Seadrift, it's really predominantly sandy open bottom habitat. So we can be confident in the conclusion that we won't really harm that nearshore environment by implementing nature-based alternatives. Public access. Similar to the ecology, having more beach over the long run is a good thing for public access. You get more access along the shore. Having a dune, a more gradual dune face to traverse is easier than, say, a rock revetment if you need to get to the beach in a particular location. So you'll have more beach over the long term, as well as in the short term after storm erosion events, if you've got a big dune that's buffering the wave run up compared to a cobble or compared to a rock revetment. So yeah, similar disruption to beach access during construction as armoring. You've got to close the beach to build these features in certain areas, as well as maintenance events. You need to get heavy equipment out to maintain these things depending on the extent of maintenance. And then during and after storm events, the beach is generally a dangerous place to be during a storm event. But if you've got the top of a dune to sit on or look at the beach, it might be safer than standing on a pile of rocks. Another consideration that we took into account for the evaluation are the regulatory, potential regulatory and permitting requirements. And so, all options essentially would require an extensive effort to obtain agency approval. but it's understood that armoring could pose a larger permitting challenge than the natural features. And this is the list of permits that you would need to obtain to implement any type of coastal adaptation at Stinson Beach, given it's an amazing place, an amazing natural place. So there are a lot of jurisdictions that and agencies that would need to approve such a project. So we took all of these categories: the design life analysis, storm protection, coastal habitat benefits, environmental impacts, regulatory considerations, public access benefits, and constructability. And we thought about them really hard, and we scored them on a 1 to 5 score. This really hard to read matrix is just a teaser to get you into that report so you could get in there and read what the summaries are. But it's a really great and succinct product to look at this feasibility study. And so we looked at a number of different metrics for each of these categories and come up with scores. And in total, we have, out of the maximum of 35, alternative 0 scores at 11, alternative 1, the more natural, scores at 23, and alternative 2, the enhanced natural, scores at 21. So considering all of these evaluation categories, a natural infrastructure system, it can be effective and feasible at Stinson Beach. We need to get to the conclusion. So here, natural infrastructure, it's a feasible alternative. In the near term, we're talking about 3.3 feet of sea level rise. It's a viable alternative. As the county will embark on the next phases for the community-wide Stinson Beach adaptation planning, you don't just have the beach. There's the Bolinas Lagoon, there's East Coot Creek. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities that start to stack up once you get beyond 3.3 feet of sea level rise. And so there might be even larger scale things that need to occur. But looking at just on the beach for the purpose of protecting development from the beach side and maintaining the beach and all of its functions, we think that the nature-based adaptation is a feasible approach. Dune elements are more consistent with the natural setting at Stinson, but while the cobble gravel berms can degrade access during stormy winters, when they get exposed, it's a little bit harder to walk over a cobble berm, although not as hard as climbing down a rock revetment. And they may similarly degrade ecology if you have the beach, intertidal beach disappear and end up with a cobble berm in the winter. That's a little less desirable ecologically, but they still do their purpose, and the beach would build back over the winter. So they provide a protective feature, but they're just a little less natural. That's why that enhanced alternative scored a little bit less. Natural infrastructure provides the benefits to recreation and ecology beyond traditional armoring, and it doesn't preclude different approaches in the future. You could implement some dunes, and that could help sustain a beach for a while, and perhaps there's just quick sea level rise. Climate change is faster. We have faster sea level rise, or there's more storms, or sand source becomes hard to obtain. And at that point, the community could shift gears and take a step in another direction on its adaptive pathway. So they could work great in the near term, and they don't preclude any future options. So the world is the oyster. They could be constructed and maintained. Natural infrastructure could be constructed and maintained with 3.3 feet of sea level rise more cheaply than traditional armoring. They can provide storm erosion protection greater than traditional armoring if they're properly maintained. We maintain that cobble width and that dune width. They can do a great amount to reduce wave impacts during storms. The design life of natural infrastructure really depends on the timing of construction and the vegetation establishment relative to storm events. So to have the dunes, a little bit more solid and intact, you need that vegetation to really establish. So if you have a really big storm event right after you build it, a dune or cobble, that's bad luck, or just, you'll have to maintain it more. So we're talking about a very dynamic system on the beach. And so the timing and overall design life depends on nature, which is just hard to know exactly what it will do. And then final takeaway, permitting will be a challenge. I don't know anyone that has a different perspective on permitting, but it will be a challenge regardless of the option. What to do next? So specifically talking about dunes and cobble berms at Stinson Beach, we could develop a preliminary design for an integrated project for the whole coast. And that would include a number of things. We need to get more detail on sediment sources, really understand quantity and quality and the characteristics of sediments available in the region. We need to coordinate with the National Park Service regarding the implementation of their overall operations and maintenance there, and integrate with future renovations of the Stinson Beach facility. We need to consider public access elements, such as boardwalks and fencing through the dunes, given, depending on what kind of dune is constructed. A big dune embankment is nice because it prevents waves from hitting the development, but it's, in the winter especially, kind of a steep thing to access. So if we were going to do a dune embankment, we need to come up with a sensible public access staircase to put down the dune face, for example, or other preferred access pathway through the dunes, so that they can be more naturally maintained and keep people out of them so that they don't get trampled, essentially. We need to refine, we could refine the analysis of sediment movement away from the placement area, to understand how sediment exchanges up and down the coast and may affect ecology and persistence of these dunes, as well as study the response of the cobble gravel berms to elevated wave and water level events. It's kind of an academic oriented item there, but it would greatly benefit a design for these types of features. Refine the analysis of shore erosion and backshore flooding. So, do some more modeling when we develop the designs to really hone in the different criteria. How tall does a dune need to be? How wide? We did our best in this feasibility study, but when you get to design level, that requires more thorough analysis to understand. A cobble berm might need to be a little higher in one reach, for example, and compared to another. More detailed engineering estimates of the specific construction costs associated with this preliminary design, looking at the quantities needed to produce these refined designs, preliminary construction drawings, renderings, etc. Implementation funding. Potentially we could do a test project in a smaller area of the beach prior to implementing for the whole beach, for example. And then monitoring. It's always great to have more monitoring data. The beach is always changing. And if we can know more data points about how that beach is changing, we can do a better job as engineers and planners to adapt and respond to sea level rise and storm impacts. And with that, we can open it up to another round of questions. This is my befuddled beach selfie. Is anyone else as befuddled as I look in this photo?
I don't think so.
Great.
In terms of questions, we're pressing up against 7 o'clock. It's 6:58. So I just want to, I have a slide, but I'm not going to try to switch out the slide shares here. So if you would like to have a question answered that you didn't get answered, please feel free to email me. You can email me at llacko@marincounty.org. And Marin County is one word when you use that email. If I can't answer the question, I will, I'll tag James for some help, but in all likelihood, I can answer it. Thank you, Kathleen. And then if anyone wants to stay on a little longer, James, I sent some questions to you in the chat.
Okay. Okay.
So you can look at those. One of the questions that I think would be interesting to answer right off the bat is why can't you just do sand replenishment instead of a dune system? Has there been a study of just doing that?
That's a good question. Specifically at Stinson and Seadrift, for that matter, you're right up against a marine sanctuary. And so if you affect the marine sanctuary, that triggers a whole nother level of permitting or issues, essentially. And so early on in this feasibility study, we identified that beach nourishment would trigger more stringent issues with having direct impacts to the marine sanctuary. And we also thought about longshore sediment transport, and having a big wide beach built out, we could potentially experience inlet issues in Bolinas Lagoon if that widened beach were to go up in sediment and choke up the lagoon mouth. That could be a potential issue. So if you look in plan view, our adaptation alternatives are kind of minimal up at Seadrift West next to that lagoon mouth, and sort of grow in extent as you get away from that that west end at the lagoon mouth. And so we sort of filtered the beach nourishment out as an option for this particular feasibility study. In the future, it may be needed in addition to dunes to keep a beach at Stinson and Seadrift. But for the purposes of this feasibility study, and as we thought about the concepts, we've decided to focus on building alternatives that are constructible within the dry beach. That's a good question, because it's a beach nourishment is used in a lot of areas, and could be an extra tool in the toolbox for Seadrift and Stinson moving forward.
Yeah. I think you have a couple more questions there.
Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to navigate this chat here. Question 2, the beach is wider without the cobble. Yeah, so in some of the alternatives, initially we're building these alternatives in the available beach space. And so if you're just looking at beach width, yeah, the available beach does shrink initially because you've got dunes occupying half of the beach, or a cobble berm occupying half of the beach. But the overall shore width over time is maintained longer. So the shore width meaning the beach plus the cobble plus the dune, if you've got those 3 features in a particular location. And so over time, that overall beach width is maintained, the overall shore width is maintained longer, and you may end up with a slightly narrower beach, but one that persists longer with a natural infrastructure approach compared to a traditional armoring approach in which the beach just shrinks, and once it shrinks, it's gone because the armoring isn't moving. Whereas the cobble and the dunes move and allow a natural beach to persist over time. So yes, you do lose some beach initially by building a dune or a cobble berm at the back of the beach. Let's see. Let's see here.
And James, why don't we just go until, I don't know, a little like 7:10 and not any longer?
Okay.
I know that you're on the clock and everyone has things to get to.
Yeah. And I think the second question speaks to that issue of having some beach moved from the beach category to the dune category initially. What is the likelihood of cobble erosion, and what kind of a mess would it make? Bringing in all the cubic yards of material, would this be done on trucks or roads? Is there a marine delivery alternative? So these are all really great questions, and ones that I would love to think through with the county and you all as we progress this kind of alternative into the future. The cobble would likely be activated, over the course of its design life. That's why we're looking at, implementing it. But they would respond in a dynamic way. They work sort of as a revetment, but a more natural one that can move with time and with storm events and kind of flatten out in the process. Limit that wave run up beyond the cobble and keep the beach in a wider, flatter form, or the shore in a wider, flatter form that is more able to recover. If you look at a rock revetment, if you lose all the beach, it's hard for that beach to really build back up, because the waves can continue to come in and hit those rocks and provide the energy needed to keep moving the sand out of that area. They would be maintained likely with trucks, bringing in new material if there's a big enough erosion, or over time you need to rebuild those cobble berms to be a little bit higher. Say if you have 2 feet of sea level rise, you might want you need to raise those cobble berms so they can stay effective. And yes, that would be that kind of material, cobble and gravel, would most likely be delivered by land in trucks and spread out with construction equipment. There's a number of potential opportunistic sources of cobble and gravel that we identified and documented in our reports. One of which is right at East Coot Creek. The periodic maintenance that's done to remove gravel and cobble from the creek could be beneficially reused at the beach in a cobble gravel berm, or reused for other purposes on the beach at National Park Service or other shore reaches. But sand could be delivered potentially by water. That might be an option. The Army Corps of Engineers maintains a shipping channel through the Golden Gate ebb shoal. There's a huge fan that extends kind of from your beach out, tens of miles, and comes and connects back up to sort of the Ocean Beach area. And so they dredge a channel through that, and they move that material in barges over to the south and place it. And that material washes up. That's why North Ocean Beach is so wide. You could use that material and take a barge offshore of Stinson Beach and pump that onto shore to nourish the beach in the future, or to pump it up onto the dry beach and use that sand to build up the dunes. But all those details would need to be thought out, and obviously a lot of coordination would need to happen to use that marine source. But I would say most likely cobble and gravel would probably come from a terrestrial source with trucks. There could be some more interesting marine excavation options out there, but I'll move on to the next question.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. Has a North Beach evaluation been made? Where is sand simply imported? I don't quite understand that question. I think I'll just take a second to try to answer it. They right now manage erosion issues at the south end of Ocean Beach by taking sand from the north end, because it's accreting due to the factors I've previously talked about. And so they just truck it down the beach and put it on the beach. There could be an option for finding sand that way. If it's taking sand from Ocean Beach, I don't know if that would be feasible, but in the long term, when sand is scarce, maybe any source could be a potential source. And then last question, what's your best guess on how long it would take to get requisite permits, approval, and the odds of actually getting this through and done? I'm going to say I'm optimistic. And I can't answer the permitting question because I'm not a permitting expert. But I like to be optimistic, and I think that it would be a great option for Stinson, and it would help maintain the beach and all of the functions that it serves, including helping to reduce storm exposure of the community in the near term. And dunes are cool. So I'll end it on a positive note.
And I will add that the regulatory chapter actually lays out a step-by-step process to get through the permitting process. So although it is cumbersome, it's certainly possible. And there's greater and greater coordination among those permitting agencies on the coastline in this region. So I'm with James. I think it is possible. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for coming and staying late. I really appreciate all the questions. I'd like to thank James for being here, for pulling together a really fantastic study, really using his expertise wisely, and for coming back for this presentation. I like to think that I'm pretty capable, but there's no way I could have pulled that off. So thank you, James. And I'd also like to thank Jack Leapster for having the foresight to really run all of the adaptation planning that's happening on the coastline in Marin County. It's really a big haul, and he's really done a masterful job of pulling so many different studies and planning efforts together towards this. So. And thank you to Julia and Kathleen for helping out with this meeting. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Leslie.